Welcome everyone to this session called The History of the Kurdish Women's Movement in Four Parts of Kurdistan. Many of these, this session and many sessions to come are a part of a series that has been put together by the Kurdish Women's Movement. And particularly this session, we thought it was fitting to start with, because particularly since the historical resistance in Kobanê against ISIS in northern Syria, many images of Kurdish women as fighters of the YPG especially have been widely published. But many people still don't really know the history, the foundations of where the Kurdish women who fought in northern Syria derived their strength from. And therefore, we're going to attempt to begin the discussion in this session of how the Kurdish women's movement derived its strength from the construction of a democratic, multi-ethnic, ecological, and gender liberationist social system, and that it has a 40-year history of resistance, particularly against Turkish state occupation and annihilation. And in this seminar, we want to learn about the manifold and the enlightening history of the Kurdish women's movement in four parts of Kurdistan. And of course, women in all parts of, at all times of Kurdistan have struggled, but this talk is particularly about the organized revolutionary Kurdish women's movement. And we thought it was specifically important, given the current climate, that many discussions are happening all across the world, particularly many political or ideological divides no longer really make sense anymore. For many of us, they didn't really make sense before, but now a lot of people are discussing this in this way. So we thought it was fitting to discuss the accumulation of Kurdish women's movement resistance, knowledge, and from that to organization, to freedom, and also maybe even more crucially today, common struggle beyond solidarity. Because even though many aspects of the issues of the system of the world that we live in today are discussed, still the liberation of women is not understood as the very foundation of liberation of all, because history is not approached, analyzed, or discussed in a methodology with regard to truth in a meaningful way. So hopefully with Nagahan Akarsel today, we will attempt to address those issues. And just before we start, please take a look at, we will mention this at the end as well, please take a look at the series we have put together for you. Our first one started with, on Thursday, our panel series, discussing particularly a feminist perspective on the issue of prisons and alternatives to it. And also we have a series of webinars, which this is the first of. And also please subscribe to our YouTube channel, where all of these are live streams. So many of you are probably watching this on YouTube, and you can keep up to date with all the material that we'll be putting out there. So we have Nagahan Akarsel with us today. She's an author, she's a Kurdish women's rights activist, and also part of the editorial board of the Genealogy magazine, which is periodically published. And we'll, at a later webinar, we'll be discussing genealogy, so we probably won't get much into it today. But yeah, we have Nagahan today with us. Heval Nagahan, dudukari desvebike.
Tamam. Beri her tişteki slavris diroga tevgera azadiya jinin Kurdistan emi iro havalan ra parva bikin. Rastici diroga ka usa hem hundru her kedi xoda pir tişt stratejiyan kirin. Emi hewl bidin nif saateda wana ve havalan ra parva bikin. Hinek zahmete جبار کو دروکا که زندیه یعنی اف دروکا زندی هنگ جبر دوامه اف diroq ya da şehit ketine disa hema hin jiyan jiyan tikin hene ji bo wê jî hinek erkê xwe jî giran e destpêkê dixwazim wê ji hevalan re bêjim.
Firstly, I want to say hello and thank you for having me. Today, we're going to try and cover the brief history of the Kurdish women's movement. It's a history that has a lot. It's a history that is, large and rich, and therefore will be difficult to do justice in some ways, because it's a history that is alive and that continues. And throughout this history, there's been many who have fallen. There are many who are living. And therefore it is a heavy topic to cover, but we will try and do it in half an hour today.
Yani Kurdistan vek axa ke vnaha çar parçayan vek parça buyne yekemin hazar şasudu sülnehan vek hevpeymana kasri şirin çetibe ve deme Rojava Kurdistan o embijin işte Kurdistan dibe du parça pişti ve hazar nasıl bistan deji Kurdistan dibe çar parça yani dema em rastiye Kurdistan'e nizanıbın rastiye jinin Kurdistan'e eğer nizanıbın em nikarin ev şoreşe naha çetibe ev kelin usa keliyanda şoreşek çetibe em nikarin fan bükün ji bo jî yani şoreşe Kurdistan'e şoreşe çar parçayı Kurdistan'e Kurdan despêtike derdorê xwe jî bandor dike, welatê di nav de jî bandor dike, wek em bêjin Türkiye, İran, Irak û Sûriye jî bandor dike. Dîsa bi gav hemû cîhanê de jî bandorê xwe çedibe. Ji ber ku ev rastiya Kurdistanê yani jiyankirine gelê Kurdistanê bi gelê dîtir ve jî ser esasî yani parvekirine çand û parvekirine dîrok û parvekirine jiyanê ve tê meşandin. Hundirî vê çarparçeyê de rastiya jinê jî vek rêbaz yani rastiya jinê dîroka jinê em ê çawa bigirin dest rêbazê wê jî bo me mühim e.
So it's important to understand that Kurdistan is a land that has been divided into four parts. The initial division of Kurdistan began with division into two parts, and then in the 1920s into four parts with various treaties and agreements and so on. And therefore, it's important to understand the reality of Kurdistan to be able to understand the reality of Kurdish women, and therefore the effects of a land being divided into four parts, how it affects these questions, and how it particularly even affects its surroundings. The division of Kurdistan into four parts has also, especially affected Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and also kind of like step by step also affected, other parts and around the world as well. And also it's affected the way we live with others, the sharing of culture, history, life, and therefore understanding the four parts of Kurdistan and understanding the history of women's struggle is, for me, it's important to the method in which we approach this history.
Kurdistan'e çanda xodevandî pêş dikevin, yani hevan dizanin wek telxalaf cê civakbûyînê dîsa em bêjin li Amedê çayonû heye li derê, dîsa li Xerebrêşk heye Urfam, li Rojhilatê navîn li Zagrosan dîsa li başûrê Kurdistanê çemçema û pir ciyan de aslında ev nirxên xwedewandî yani nirxên civaka xwezayî nirxên çanda neolitik xuyayînin û li van derine jî wek çanda xwedewandî jî çanda înana, çanda îştar, çanda kubaba, çanda atargatis yani ev aynı zamanda dikeve Bakurî Sûriyê jî dîsa em bêjin çanda hepat û pûdê hepa ev çanda jî hene ev çanda jî heya niha jî şopê xwe derdikevin holê yani li Kurdistanê Kurdistan wekî hilala zêrîn
I mean, we knew this might happen. I think they have lost power. You know, it's kind of the nature of being in Rojava. But while maybe she tries and figures it out, I'll
bu borunun internet heye li etne kereveç ma internet ayakır ez karım berdevam bikim bu dengimin tane var. Çetbe
اريد به از verger bikim tu xwe hinek yani ew bike.
yani
So
muhatınca gidiyor ama disse demek ki Kurdistan bindeste ama yani peki hatam reneketine bu borunun yani hani Kurdistan ve ki hakka piroza yani vak yavana zerin yani bat el nehrin üç şekli de navkırın o durda çanda xodevanti peştaye ev çand bu duruka tevgera Kurdistan'e naha vak duruka kızında ektibe jitbe bengehek.
So when we talk about Kurdistan, it's really important to understand the historical cultures, particularly the culture of the goddess is still present in Kurdistan when we talk about, and across the Middle East in general. You know, for example, the Chaychaman in Ahmed and like places in Urfa, the Zagros, and in South Kurdistan and so on. So you know, when we discuss this, it's important to understand the natural society that is present here, the effects of the culture of goddesses like Inanna, Ishtar, Kubaba, and many others. And you know, this is something especially for us to be celebrated, and it's a very important foundation of the culture of Kurdistan.
Naha kerebe hat em video tukarım bekin.
Tamam.
Ve ne bu? Ha, tamam. Tamam tekrar merhaba. Yani de Kurdistan'da rastlıya jine dema emtigrin dest yani Mezopotamya yani Kurdistan veki axa xwedevanda dest girtin pir mühime. Jber ku vek dirokej dema emtigrin dest em dibêjin dirok zindiye yani dirok ne tiştekî hatê jiyan kirin û xelas biye dirok zindiye û her tim berdevam dike û haqiqat jî li ser kokê xwe şîn dibe. Yani ji bo wê jî dema em diroka Kurdistanê taybet jî diroka jinên Kurdistanê digirin dest em du rastiyan dînin ziman. Yek dirok aniha berdewam e, dirok zindî ye, dirok niha ye, ê dîtir jî haqiqat li kî derê hûn de bûye ê li derê were dîtin. Yani hakikat li kir veşartiye gerek de li derê derbixî holê. Ev dema em dirok digirin dest yani ilmi pozitivist ilmi naha kapitalist modernite xwesa saz kiriye ev ilmi pozitivist dibêje dirok xeteke düze yani xeteke her tim işte hinek diş dibin encamê wan hinek diş dibin encamê wan hene wek qader dirok digirin dest em tevlî vê nêrîne nabin em dibêjin dirok devrê xwe heye döngüsel yani döngüsel e û her tim dirok di nav sosyolojiyê civakê de em bêjin nav çanda civakê de işte nav jiyanê da xwe berdevam dike. Ji bo wê jî dîrok hem zindî digrin dest û wek heqîqeta veşartî dîrokê de heyî derxistina holê jî wekî erkekî dibînin.
So it's important to, as mentioned, understand the reality of the history of Mesopotamia and the culture of goddesses, and especially that when we approach the history of the Kurdish women's movement, that history is alive and that it continues, and truth can only be constructed on its roots, on its foundations. And as we said, history continues with time, and also truth can only be found or can be uncovered where it was lost historically. So that's also really important to understand. But what we see at the moment in this system, and particularly through the institutionalization of capitalist modernity through positivist science, is that history is understood or accepted as a result of events. And we don't agree with this analysis. We believe that history is circular history, and that history can be found in the sociology, culture, and life of society.
Yani dîrok yekpare destgirtin ji bo me mühim in. Ji bo wê jî dema em dîroka Kurdistanê digirin dest, dîroka jinên Kurdistanê digirin dest, em dibêjin axa xwedevan da ye. Dîsa dîroka Kurdistanê dîroka berxwedanî ye, gelek jin van berxwedanî de cî xwe girtine. Yani wek Zadire Xanim, Xanzade Sultan, Adile Xan, Hafse Xan Nakib, Zarife, Bese, em bêjin Leyla Qasım, wana hemûyan jî di dîrokê de cî xwe digirin. Ev ji bo tevgera rizgariya azadiya jinên Kurdistan jî wek bingehekî ava dike. Dîsa em bêjin ev nirxên sed salên dawî, her du sed salên dawî alî feminîzm ve hatina avakirin jî wek çavkaniyekî tevgera azadiya Kurdistanê jin em dibînin. Ji ber ku ev ceribandinên hatine çêkirin, ev teoriyên hatine avakirin, wana hemûyan di rêgerîna jinê de, di berxwedaniyê jinê de bingehekî ava dikin. Tabii yani hani wana wek min wisa Kurd ji bo Kurdistanê ve girêdanbûyîna xwe çêbibe min got anî ziman. Esas da em bêjin 1907 de Rêber Abdullah Öcalan lêgerînê xwe çêdibin. Em dikarin bêjin lêgerînên Rêber Abdullah Öcalan her aliyê de aslında ji bo azadiya jin, ji bo pêwîstiyê azadiya jin bingehekî xurt ava dike û heya niha jî ev berdevam dike. Nakokî xwe, yani nakokiyên xwe zaroktiyê de jiyan dike, nakokî xwe vidayîkî xwe re jiyan dike, nakokî işte xuşkî xwe re jiyan dike, hevalê xwe re jiyan dike, ev zawcandinên bi temenî çûk dema dibîne nakokiyên jiyan dike, wana hemûyan lêgerîneke xurt Rêber Abdullah Öcalan de jî çê dike. 1907 de em bêjin 1968 wê demê alî feminîst, ekolojik û demokratîk hinek hewldan hene. Em bêjin işte hinek serêrakirin heye li Tirkiyeyê jî ev tên dîtin. Wek sosyalizm, yani lêgerîna sosyalizm, lêgerîna jiyaneka nû, lêgerîna jiyaneka azad pêş dikeve. İşte ev dem da êdî hêdî gruba PKK dêger hevdû. Gruba PKK yani hundirî PKK'yê de em dikarin bêjin tevgera azadiya jin yani tevgera azadiya Kurdistanê ve her du hundirî hev de pêş dikevin û wek dîroka tevgera azadiya jin jî em dikarin wek dîroka Rêber Abdullah Öcalan û PKK bigirin dest. yani diroga jin Kurdistan bi rêber Abdullah Öcalan û PKK destpêtike bingehê xwe jî ji nirxên hem bi ser xaka Kurdistanê tê jiyan kirin hem jî li cîhanê de bi feminîzm û ev şoreşên netewî de jinên tê de cî xwe digirin doan de jî stûk digire.
So it's important to approach history in a holistic way, and the history of Kurdistan and the history of Kurdish women also go hand in hand, and we can't approach them, or we can't try and understand them divorced from each other, especially when we consider and understand that Kurdistan is the land of goddesses, and many women historically kind of have their space in history in this sense. And many Kurdish women, as were shown on the slideshow, have their space in the history of resistance, as you can see on the screen right now, and therefore form the foundations of not just the Kurdish women's movement, but the Kurdish liberation movement in general. And therefore, with the searches and the researches and so on of this century, many I suppose experiments have been carried out, and in that sense, I've only been able to talk about it in a very brief way because of time limits. But what I can say is, since the 1970s, the search of Reber Abdullah Öcalan is the search essentially of Kurdistan's liberation, but also his search is also the foundations of Kurdish women's liberation as well. The contradictions that he lived from childhood, the contradictions with his seeing with his mother, with his sister, seeing around him young women being forced to marry at a young age. This triggered and created a very strong search within himself. And since particularly therefore since the 68 movements around the world, the uprisings across the world, the feminist, ecological and socialist searches for a new life developed, this is when also the PKK started coming together as a group. The Kurdish freedom movement started coming together as a group, and therefore the Kurdish freedom movement and the history of the Kurdish women's movement and Abdullah Öcalan must be understood in a holistic way in relation with each other.
Yani alîkî de jî li Kurdistanê yani jin rastiya jin hatiye birkirin û betonkirin. Yani PKK hemberî ev birkirinê û betonkirinê jî derketinekî çêdike. PKK bi tespîta Kurdistan metingehe dikeverî û tevgera azadiya jinê jî bi vê tespîtê Kurdistan metingehe dikeverî û li ser vê bingehê xwe ava dike. Dîsa dema destpêkê yani hani gruba pekê ava dibe wê demê beşdarbûyînên yekemîn ê fermî 1976 û hefteyan da çêdibe. Ê yekemîn wek 1976 da Fatma yani jî navê xwe fermî Kesire Yıldırım. Ê dir jî heval sara sakine cansız tevlî bûyînê xwe çêdikin. Damezrandina PKK da yani damezrandina PKK civina yekemîn da ê 27 mijdarê 1978 da çêdibe du jin yani 22 kes hene navan da du jin hene yek heval Sara'ya Şehit Sara sakine cansız yek jî Fatma'ya yani her du civina yekemîn ê partiye da cî xwe dikirin. Karin bêjin yani heval Sara heval sakine cansız jiyana xwe wek jiyana tevgera azadiya jin tê penasêkirin alî serokatî ve alî rêber Abdullah Öcalan ve ji ber ku destpêkê de haya dawî berxwedaniyeke pir mezin hem zindanan de hem li civakê de hem artêşbûyînê de hem alî partî bûyînê de her aliyan de kedeke mezin pêş dixe wek xeta azadî yani nav şoreşa me de xeta heva sare xeta azadî em penasê dikin. Dîsa Fatma heye yani ev jî mühim e. Fatma jî di paşveritû de ısrar dike û wek em bêjin ev hem alî zihniyet de hem alî bawer nekirina şoreşa da işte jiyana taybet xastin da pir aliyan da wisa ev ji xeteke tasfiyekar yan ji xeteke kulîtî di nav şoreşê de dayetma dike. Yani dikarin wisa binav bikin yani dujin tevlî demezrandina pêkê de cî xwe digirin heval Sara xeta azadî temsil dike û Fatma jî xeta kolêtî temsil dike. Ev her du xet jî em bêjin heya niha yani ev xetê heval Sara xeta azadî niha bi şoreşa Rojava jî zaten wisa wek sistem jî sistemeke demokratîk ekolojik û ser esasê azadiyê jinê xwe dike.
So, on the one hand, while many of these steps were happening in Kurdistan, the reality, the reality of women was a forgotten reality and essentially a cemented denial of women, and therefore the kind of launch or the launch of the PKK is based on the analysis that Kurdistan is a colony, and therefore women must also take their place in this as also a part of this colony, and therefore the officially Kurdish women being part of the PKK starts from 1976 and 77, and initially in 1976 Fatma, whose real name is Kesre Yildirim, officially joins, and then in 1977 Hevasara Sakine Janssens also officially joins it, and on the 27th of November 1978 the PKK as a party is officially founded, and with 22 people present, and two of them were women. One was Sara and one was Fatma. And it's important to understand the two women who were present at the founding of the Kurdish freedom movement, because Sara, as Reber Abdullah Öcalan also says, is her life is the history of the Kurdish women's movement, and therefore till the end her life was a life of resistance and a life of struggle, from prison to her life in general to the process of becoming a party. Her line is what we consider the line of freedom. But also it's important to understand Fatma, so Kesre Yildirim, is a very important person in understanding the other line that was also present at the time in the party for women, and that was the belief of what we call the mentality of the enslaved woman, and through her imposing essentially like a lack of belief on revolution and a very classic enslaved women's mentality, it was important to struggle against that, and therefore to understand that the necessary internal women's struggle and revolution. But what we can see now is when we talk about the Rojava revolution and the Kurdish women's movement, that it was Sara's line that succeeded and that is being practiced in a democratic, ecological, and women's liberationist way in Rojava and many parts of Kurdistan.
نوبری سال 1975 و 79 da civin den çekrin. Disa perverde den dayın. Yani Ali embejin gav avitine yekemin da heval sara peşenkti van civinnatke. İşte Taybet, Ali Elaziz, Dersim, işte Ali Pazarcık, Maraş, Loğan cina perverde o civin vijananra den çekrin. Ev civinna yani hani o sebep fikrin rastiye Kurt, rastiye Kurdistan'ı pir feodale o jin için civinan çetkin perverde yandıdın o tevlübün hedi çetibin. Disa evdem 1975 da yani jineke Dersim'e Nuray Erenler şey tikeve yani belki sempatizane işte dinav civinanda cihatigen ji Dersim'e ev ji vaki emdikarin bejin tevgera azadiye jinin Kurdistan'e da şeydi yekemin vaki jineka valat Paris jineka valat Paris'e o Dersim'e şey tikeve yani faşist üyedeme evşin şey tıkın disa evdem yani ev dema civin çetibin embejin etibin yani jinan derketine jmale pir zahmet çetibe ve deme rüre bazı cüda cidden şoğlandın ki bu karibin tevli kari rexistin boyune bükün yani yine ve grubun apoji işte embejin grubun talebe grubun işte sosyalist hani o sade nafkırın o doğru da şey yedi jin şey cihazgre 1977 nehanda yani ve deme aslında amadehi heyi amadehi kongre PKK yekemin de bu ve amadehi bir yerde girdin vak broşürek var amade kirin yani bu ligerina azadiye jin çip evisten kaş benkirin ligerin varın amade kirin evdem işte heval Sara Elazığ hazırına sahaftı nahanda de girdin o ev karşı nameşe ama ev hevalin üdeme grubun üdeme jivak grubun geçen den nafkirin yani emtukarın bejin hani ev dema despikeda yani heza insan yek keçi bebe yani zaten diruka PKK şu aliva ve jiyana Riber Abdullah Öcalan ve Gredem Tigrindes ev heza insan dertke ve hole o gav çava rixistintike disa heval sara mesatvi rixistin boyuna da roleki mezin dilize ev de xoya kirin yani heza insan derxistina hole da diroka PKK diroka paşke diroka tevgera azadiye jine pir minakin usa henem Kongre'ye PKK yeke çetti ve megut yani burada işte manifesto de amade kirin liberi da mezrandına partiye bir çalakiye hilvan sivereke çetti ve de berxudani hilvan edici role jine de peşteye mesela evdem dayka dure heye o çend jine edici hene evna hem pişkret edin ev çalaki hem jit şaradariya hilvaneda cihatigirin yani dayka dure disa ve ki dayka hanım yavar kayıcı de zanin pişre zaten bastık. Yani pişti veci zaten darbeye 12 İlan 1908 anda çetibe o da zindan anda berxudani desbetkin. Berxudaniye heval sara ve serpehati de gotin nav gelda düşman ji pir ji bandortu be ji ber ku sekneke pir xurt demeşandın o hazar yani dema pişti hava mazundan onat işte havalin çar havanın çalekiyen çetkin işte çalekiye منه برچه بوینه یک هوال کمال پیروانه همویان دم دمشین evdem yani hava sakine سێکمی خوا ئەم بێژن بەرخودانیەک دە مەشاندن ژی وەک درۆکە کوردستانێدا میناکەکە یعنی درۆکە زینداناندا درۆکە بەرخودانی زینداناندا ژی میناک دێتن.
So since the 1970s, particularly with the leadership of Sakine Janses, there was meetings all across in some parts of Kurdistan, in places like Elazığ, Dersim, Pazarcık, and across Maraş. And it's really important to understand the reality of feudal Kurdistan so we can understand the importance of these women's meetings. So Sara and other women would go to these parts of Kurdistan and have meetings with women. And also one of the things that happened in 1975, Nuray Erater, who is seen also as who plays a very important role in Kurdish women's movement history, is she was essentially a Kurdistan sympathizer, and she was killed by fascists. And this also had a very big effect on the motivation for mobilizing women, but also had an effect on Kurdish women's like love for their own land. And so there was, especially in the 70s, there was a process of mobilizing women for at the time what was called the apogées, and also in the preparations for the first Congress of the PKK, there was a brochure being prepared titled "Search for Women's Freedom," which would be used as a mobilization material tool. But unfortunately, because in 1979, Sakine Janses was caught by Turkish police, this brochure unfortunately didn't get made in the end. But it's important to understand that from the start, even if it's one person, the method in which you mobilize is very important, because the mobilization and the organizing was done step by step, and we can see this particularly in the way Abdullah Öcalan, Reber Abdullah Öcalan organized people. And Sara plays a very big role, Sakine Janses plays a very big role in creating power of people and mobilizing people, and therefore sets a big example, and has set a big example for the Kurdish women's movement, and is very important for that. So there's an example of the Kurdish women's history of the actions that were carried out in Hilwan, Siverek, and the resistance of women here is very important. There's someone called Mother Dure, who took place, who was a part of the municipality there, and their resistance was very important. Also, therefore, after that, in 1980, the 12 September 1980 military coup in Turkey, many people who were part of the Kurdish freedom movement, including Sakine Janses, were in prison. And this is where Sakine Janses set one of the biggest precedents in her stand and in her resistance in prison. She motivated many people to also resist and take a stand. And also, people like Mazlum Doğan and other people who took part in other actions and death fasts took Sakine Janses also as an example.
يعني نوبري سالن حزر ناسد حشتيان و حزر ناسد نوت يعني نوبري حشتي والنوت دا إيدي يعني أو جنين تغلي بكيت بن إيدي يعني هدي derbasi rojlata navîn dibin, tevlîbûyînê xwe fermî çêdibin. Lê dere li beqa işte rêxistin dibin, perwerde dibînin û piştre mesela vergerî welat çêdikin. Yani em dikarin bêjin ev navberê 1980 û 90 da giştî PKK'yê da yani tevlîbûyînên jin hêdî çêdibin û ev jinên tevlî dibin hemû perwerdeyê re derbas dibin û diçin qadên şer, diçin qadên civakî, diçin qadên em bêjin rêxistinkirinê rêxistinbûyînkî de rêxistin bikin, qadan rêxistin bikin. Ev dem yani hevala ezme ya mezin heye mihriban saran ev jî yekem jinek û derdkeve çiyayê şerefdînê yani wek tecrübeyê gerîla yekemin jiyan dike ev hevalan. Dîsa 1980 yekan de hevala bese anûş heye. Ev heval wek şehîdî yekemin PKK'de yekemin jin de navkirin. Ev dem em bêjin kongreyên PKK çêdibin yani hani kongreyê PKK duyemîn çêdibe di kongreyê de hêdî em bêjin hemû kongreyan da jin jî hêdî beşdarbûyînê xwe çêdibin. Kongreya herî giring em bêjin yani hani alî wek kongreya 1986 da kongreya sêmîn heye ev kongreyê de ev kongre pir mühim e ji ber ku ev kongre yani giştî di jiyana em bêjin giştî di ekêm dîroka PKK da dîroka tevgera azadiya jinê da yani hem alî tehlîlkirine pirsgirêkan, tehlîlkirine kesayetan, tehlîlkirine ev pirsgirêkên civakê fixara kesayet dînin hem jî alî em bêjin hemberî dijmin şerê te meşandin da gavên mezin gavaka mezin fixara ava dike. Ev yani hani vê merhaleyê de eval dizanin mesela hani me gota dîroka PKK û dîroka tevgera azadiya jinê dikeve nav hevdira dimeşe vê demê 1984 da işte hamleya 15 tebaxê çêdibe Dorda biryardayîna artêşbûyînê tê dîtin, tê girtin. Dîsa em bêjin biryargirtina yani hani piştî yani kongreyê de işte biryara argeke, RNK yani ide wekî artêş, wekî enî xwe rêxistinkirin pêş dikeve. Dîsa vê demê mesela Akademiya Mahsûn Korkmaz yani fermî yani ji bo avakirina Akademiya Mahsûn Korkmaz biryar tê girtin. Vê kongreyê de işte herî mîhûn yek jiya ve işte xebatên jinên xweser bi biryargirtina sistemê ve jî tê avakirin. Yani êdî wek xebatên jin wek xweser xwe rêxistin bike ve biryar tê girtin. Em dikarin bêjin mesela vê kongreyê de kongreyê sêmîn de işte Rêber Abdullah Öcalan dibêje divir da tê tehlîlkirin ne kesayete civake ne kêliye dîrok e. Yani wekî diyalektika PKK em fan bikin, diyalektika Rêber Abdullah Öcalan em fan bikin. Yani ev wekî rêbazeke esasî heya niha jî tê meşandin wekî diyalektika PKK'de jî xwe digirin. Yani em dikarin bêjin 1986 da PKK Kongreya PKK sêmî vegirêdayî êdî ev kombûyînê jin ev beşdarbûyînên jin hemû wek xweser xwe rêxistin bikin biryara ve tê girtin. Yani alî jin ve biryara herî mühim ev e. Dîsa ev dem serokatî pirtûka jin û malbat dinivîsîne. Ev jî yani hani êdî ji ber ku tevlîbûyînê jin di nav partî de wek şerekî hemberî paşverûtî heyî jî yani ev şer jî giring tê dîtin ji alî ve jî em dikarin onu
So between we can say, especially between between 1980 and 1990, this is when there was a increased number of women joining the Kurdish freedom movement, and at this point, their involvement was becoming more and more official, in a sense where once they would join, they would get sent to other parts of the Middle East, particularly the Bekaa Valley, and this was to, in a sense, for their involvement to become more official. They would go through education periods and sessions at the academy that the Kurdish freedom movement had in Bekaa Valley, and here they would learn how to transform and change their homeland and so on. And also then they would get sent to various different areas of the Kurdish freedom movement, whether it was the area of armed struggle, whether it was societal areas, whether it was for the mobilization of other areas. And in this sense, Azime, which is Mihriban Saran, it has is a very important part of our history, who was she was one of the first women to be sent to the Sharaftin Mountains as a guerrilla fighter. And also Bese Anush, who is considered the first woman martyr of the Kurdish freedom movement, and she fell in the area called in the region of Kurdistan called Tohudan. And so at the second Congress of the PKK, slowly all congresses began involving more and more women, more discussion around the position of and the position and the issues of women. And the third Congress of the PKK in 1986 is a very important Congress to understand, and because many important decisions that set precedent were made there, and that was particularly about explaining and identifying issues and problems of society, of how to more effectively fight against the enemy. And also, as I said at the beginning, the history of the Kurdish women's movement and Kurdish freedom movement, it's important to understand them in a holistic way. They can't be divorced from each other. So while a lot of these developments were happening for the Kurdish women's movement, there was also the development of the general movement. The 15 August 1984 launch of the armed struggle, the more further kind of institutionalization of whether it was Liberation Army, whether it was becoming more of a party and further organizing. The Mahsum, one of the most important decisions was the official establishment of the Mahsum Korkmaz Academy, and many decisions that were made then. Perhaps the most important decision made at that Congress that affected women's the Kurdish women's movement was the decision made for women's autonomous organizing from that moment onwards. And it's important to understand the dialectic of these, I suppose, in some ways like parallel histories, but also the relationship between them. And this is how also Abdullah Öcalan approaches it as well. And therefore, one of the early books that Abdullah Öcalan wrote and published was on the question of women and the family in Kurdistan. And that was widely shared and encouraged for people to read, for that understanding to be able to start to liberate society.
Piştî kongrê 1987 da êdî yektiya jinên welat Parîzên Kurdistan konferansa xwe yekemîn çêdikin. Ev konferans rixistina xwe ya xweser saz dike li Ewropa tê çêkirin. Vê demê hevala mizgîn, yani gurbet aydin beşdarê kongreyê dibe û di wir de pirtûka jin û malbat jî tê xwendin. Yani di wir de ferq çi ye? Mesela PKK partiye yektiye jinin walat Paris'in Kurdistan yektiye o gredayı erenekeye. Yani ev vaki gava ve ali rexistin boyun ejinda em tukarın vak gava yekemin bigrendes. Yani bir yara bir rexistin kırın ejine dertke ve o bir rengi de her kadan da komiteyin xoser çetibin. Disa ambijin yani yektiye jinin walat Paris'in Kurdistan Kongre xwe duyemin û sêyemîn jî çetike. Duwarda jî êdî ambijin Kongreya xwe konferansa xwe sêyemîn da biryar de girtin ki êdî hemû yani hani ev rêxistin ji ber ku teng dimîne gerek xwe mezin bike, xwe feratir bike. Tabii ev tam nayê pêkenandin ev yani vê deme vê navberê de tevgera azadiya jinên Kurdistan jî te avakirin. Tevgera azadiya jinê Kurd wek taşk te navkirin. Yani ev merhalana rastî jî pir giran wisa pir nakûkî yani hem hundur da yani navberê jin û merda hem hemberî paşveretûyê heyê tên temsil kirin da û hem hemberî dijmin şerên pir dijber te meşandin. Yani hem şer heye hem paşveretiyên hundur alî çînî û alî zayendî de derdikevin holê hene. Evna hemûyan wisa bandorê xwe dike ama tekoşîneke pir xurt çê dibe. Hezar nasî yani eval dizanin mesela ev dem wekî em bêjin em dikarin bêjin rêxistinbûyîna jin yektiya jinên welat Parîsên Kurdistanê û tevgera azadiya jinên Kurdistanê yê ji wekê û taşk ev dem te avakirin. Piştî wê yani şehîdên vê demê mesela hani êdî me gota gerîlayê de yani jin êdî xwe xweser mangayê xwe çetkin. Dîsan qadên civakî de yani civînê xwe xweser çetkin. Yani her aliyên de alî xweserbûyîn de gavên giring te navêtin. Em dema tên 1992 duyan da işte çalakiya heval beritan heye, heval Gülnaz Karataş. Ev çalaki yani hemberî işte KDP eriştike hemberî ve de çekirdin. Ev mesela pir giringa yani ev çalakiya heval Gülnaz Karataş aslında vekî bingehda mezetkin Duruka Kurdistanê de qalayê dimdime heye. Lê derece jin ji bo teslim nebin yani hemberî xata teslimata xata îxanetê wekî xata berxwedanî didin meşandin. Awan jî zinaran da davêjin. Dîsal Dersîme mesela 1938 da ev em bêjin işte katliama Dersîm dema çê dibe textê îksor heye lê derece çil jinên Dersîmê xwe ji zinaran da davêjin. Yani teslim nabin yani xata teslimiyeta xata îxanetê hiç bi tu avayê qabûl nakin. Me gota ev xet ji alî Fatma ve de temsil kirin. Ev te hundirî şoreşê de jî yani Fatma Kongre sêyemîn de Kongre PK sêyemîn 1986 da çê dibe êdî yani rastiya Fatma jî derdikeve holê o yani ev tahlilên ev analizên tên çêkir ve gridayê Fatma jî diçe. Dîsa em dikarin bêjin mesela işte piştî yani şehadeta hevala beritan yani biryargirtina artêşbûyîn çêdibin yani biryar tê girtin ki êdî jin artêşê xwe ava bike. Ev jî wekî yektiya azadiya jinên Kurdistan yaşk 1995 da li Metina yani ev kongreyê xwe yekemîn pêkdîne dur da biryara artêşbûyînê te dayîn. Yani tıvır da tiştek heye val mühim e yani ji ber ku mesela diyalektika PKK'yê de jî heye piştî her şehadetê aslında bersivdayîneke sistembûyînê heye. Piştî her şehadetê wisa em bêjin avakirina sistema demokratîk, ekolojik û ser esasê paradigma esasê azadiya jin min hene êdî NATO mesela direkt diwan operasyonan da cê xwe digirin işte li ser serokatî mesela erişên ciddî hene pir aliyan da aslında wisa dixwazin deng bikin berxwedaniya jin hem qada civakî da alî serhildanan da hem em bêjin giştî işte hem beri daxtên dijmin li bajarên Türkiye û bajarên Avrupayê da ev berxwedaniya jin pêşengtê dike. Yani em dikarin vê bêjin rastî jî mesela li nav pekê de demên herî zehmet herî wisa em bêjin dengav den jiyankirin dûr jin têkoşînê xwe bi çalakiyê xwe derketinekê çêdike. Vê demê jî em bêjin wek pêşengtiyê serhildanan da eval dizanin mesela Bakurê Kurdistanê êdî 4,000 gund tên vala kirin. Ev dem pir êrişên dijwar li ser Bakurê Kurdistanê tên çêkirin. Serhildan tên çêkirin. Mesela işte serhildanan da pêşengtiyê heval bi neş agal çêdike. Dîsa em bêjin 1995 da ev milletê me koçber dibe diçe Ertuşê ev dem işte heval jiyan yani wisa pêşengtiya ev serhildanan dike. Yani dîsa li Avrupa ev milletê me hatî xweşber kirin yani li dere işte nahilin Newroz çêbibe işte em berî ve heval ronayî û heval bêrîvan çalakî çêdikin. Dîsa li İzmirê yani hani evan hemûyan mesela koçberbûyîn çêdibe işte milletê Kurd ji cî xwe tê kirin em berî vanan jî çalakiyên tên derxistin heval Rahşan Demirel li İzmirê çalakiyê xwe derdixe heval Zekiya Alkan destpêker 1990 li Amedê çalakiyê xwe derdixe dibe agirî Newrozê ne tafandin ez ê canê xwe dîsa şên bikim geş bikim. Yani ev dem jî em dikarin bêjin mesela êdî civakbûyînek êdî PKK nav civakê de tê nasên hemberî dijmin hevestê xwe de dîtine û pir hevalên me pir ekî me jî wê demê yani wisa bi çalakiyê xwe mezin pêşengtiya gel dikin pêşengtiya şoreşê dikin. Ev 1995 şunda da yani yaşk dema avat be yani yaşk ev gredayı işte ev komiteyn ve kevi o azadi ten avakirin piştüye bejin işte çalakiye heval zilan te çekirin çalakiye heval zilan ve gredayı o çalakiye heval sema te çekirin doğru şey em bejin em dikarin bejin edi bir yardayına part bugün te çekirin yani evan hemuyan her aliyanda em dikarin bêjin mesela yani hani merhaleyn şoreşa jine da merhaleya arteş bûyîn yani merhaleya partî bûyîn û merhaleya civakî bûyîn heye yani belki hinek wisa derêjê dibe yani rastî jî mesela yani bingehî tevgera azadiyê jin ava kirin ev rastiyê ev havanına, ev çalakine, ev manayê dûr de veşartiye. Evan jî hemû xwe giştî yani zelalbûyîne ev havanına digre. Ev wekî diyalektikekî me xwest em hevalan re parve bikin. Êdîtir tamam. Ez niha bisekinim.
So, of course, over the last decades, we have seen that women who were part of this revolutionary process took several steps towards organizing themselves autonomously. And this process started in 1987, specifically with YJWK, which is the Union of Patriotic Women of Kurdistan. This was the first time that Kurdish women within the movement organized themselves autonomously. This was founded in Europe, but it was the first of many steps that were to come in later years towards women's independent and autonomous organizing. Gurbet Aydın, whose code name is Mizgin, took part of this in this Congress, and the book that we previously mentioned, written by Abdullah Öcalan on the woman and family question in Kurdistan, was read out there. Excerpts were read there, and the Union of Patriotic Women of Kurdistan was part of the ERNK, which is the national Liberation Front of Kurdistan, and this meant that the Patriotic Union of Women in Kurdistan was part of this Liberation Front. And since then already, autonomous committees started to organize the women in society as well. The group held several congresses, and in the third congress of this institution, the decision was taken to increase and broaden organization in society. But then in later years, this was expanded even further towards the TAJK task, which is the free women's movement in Kurdistan. And all of these processes were not easy, of course. They were full of contradictions, not only between women and men, but also of everybody against societal conservatism. There were also a lot of contradictions between the women in terms of class issues, in terms of gender struggles, struggles against conservatism. And at the same time, of course, the war was very intense. So all of this, the struggle of women to autonomously organize themselves took place in the middle of war. And then in the early 90s, women started to organize themselves in the military sphere autonomously. Already women had been organizing themselves within the armed ranks in different ways, but especially after in 1992, after the death of Gulnaz Karataş, who was Heval Beritan. In 1992, she was killed in clashes with the fighters of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, KDP, who were at the time working with the Turkish state against the PKK. And she did not surrender to the forces that were attacking her. She fought to the last bullet. And so the movement then understood or interpreted her refusal to surrender, and she first broke her weapon and then she threw herself off the cliffs, that this was a refusal on the part of the Kurdish woman to surrender to what we call the line of betrayal in Kurdistan. She represented the line of resistance. And this is something that has a longer legacy, because in terms of in longer term Kurdish history, in 1938, during the Dersim uprising against the Turkish state, which was where what happened there was that there was a group of Kurdish women who refused to surrender themselves to the Turkish army, and also jumped off the cliffs of the mountains. So what we mean when we say lines of betrayal, lines of resistance, is also what I was trying to say earlier about what Sakine Justice represents, and on the other hand, what Kesire Yıldırım represents in terms of a willingness to surrender to the state, just go to the line of betrayal, to the line of surrender, versus the will to struggle. And this actually came true because already in earlier congresses in the 1980s, already Kesire Yıldırım's kind of break with the movement became clear in terms of her willingness to stay with the system and not with the revolution. After Beritan, as I mentioned, the decision was taken by the women's movement to autonomously organize in the military sphere, and as such, YASK was formed in the Metina region on the mountains. The first congress was held in 1995. YASK means the Union of the Freedom Union of Women in Kurdistan, and this was the first step towards autonomous organizing in the military sphere. And what I can say when speaking also about later stages of autonomous organizing of women in the Kurdish revolution, was that after each martyrdom, after each death of a woman, of a revolutionary, the decision was taken to further systematize the struggle. So the 1990s specifically were marked by a NATO-led attack against the movement. There were attacks on the personage of Abdullah Öcalan, for example. But already in the 1990s, women had taken part in the Serhadan, which are the rural uprisings in the Kurdish regions in Turkey. Women were taking part at the forefront of these, but at the same time, 4,000 Kurdish villages were at the time destroyed by the Turkish army. So it was a very intense time. But whenever there was an obstacle, whenever there was an impasse, the movement managed to struggle against it and take the decision to further systematize its organizedness. And then to mention some of the martyrs who left their mark, Heval Jian, for example, who's Zeynep Erdem. She was also one of the people who really marked the societal struggle. She was also killed by these collaborationist forces during in the area of Trush. And also Rashan Demirel, Kia Alkana, two women who have engaged in self-sacrifice actions, again as a response to the attacks of the colonial forces against the people, the struggle in Kurdistan. So overall, these were just some of the examples of how, and at the same time, she mentioned a few other women. And what is important here to say is that, again, for every martyrdom, the movement gave meaning to these women's struggle. Heval Zilan was yet another, of course, another guerrilla fighter whose action in 1996 in June was very important towards the movement's decision to also ideologically take the struggle further. Dengetenay.
Naha denti?
Evet.
Dengi menti?
Erite.
Tamam baş. Yani me gota dirok yani rastî pir berfrehe yani divirda vek hani bingehê hatiye avakirin me xwast em hevalan bidin nişandan yani bi taybet rêxistinbûyîn destpêkê de heya niha çawa hatiye meşandin û niha gêştê çastê ji hinek merhale mühim me xwast parve bikin yani em kurtasî dikarin bêjin yani yejeveke taşk yaşk û em bêjin yani yejeveke û taşk û wan wek bingehekî ava dikin pişta yaşk de ava kirin yaşk li salên 2007 dibe yeja star te ava kirin şoreşa Rojava ve Gredayê yeja star va yani êdî yeja star di nav civakê de rêxistin dike yani YPJ, YJŞ û YPS jin û HJR yani çar parçayê Kurdistanê de jî em mêzê dikin êdî partî xwe ava yeja star xwe ava dike ew ji bingehê xwe yaşqeva digire dest û vê demê jî teoriya qutbûyîn êdî ava dibe yani dîqet bikin mesela tê jiyan kirin û pişta teoriyê wê tê nivîsandin yani dîroka tevgera azadiyê jin rastiyek xewsê jî heye yani teorî piştî ceribandinan em bêjin piştî hevdanên tên çêkirin piştî şehadetan tê ava kirin û rêxistinbûyîn jî hevdira yani bi ve girêdayî tê çêkirin wek alî artêşbûyîn da ev artêşbûyîn niha li Rojavayê Kurdistanê ji Bakurê Kurdistanê Rojhilat û Başûrê Kurdistanê her çar parçayê Kurdistanê de jî yani yekiniyên xwe jin ê parastinê ava kirine hem alî hundirî civakê de wek parastina jin hem jî hemberî dijmin hemberî Daişê hemberî dewletan ev parastina xwe de meşandin alî artêşbûyînê de yani em mêze bikin bi yani grubin çok despetike hatta yani ser hatta azadiye hava sakine despetike naha geçtiğel çar parçayı Kurdistan'a xarı xıstıngırın avatke. Disa Ali Parti boyunda xazım bejin hava Ali Parti boyunda jî çalakiye hava zilan çalakiye hava sema giringe yani bersivdayın hava çalakiyana avakırına PJKK'ye yani despeke PJKK hazır nasıl nudinahan de avakırın evdem hazır nasıl nudinahan yani dema komploye hem her aliyanda erişten çekirin kongreyi xat van şartı merci zahmet da den çekirin pir nakukiyan jî den jiyan kirin li vek PJKK ve deme mesela PKK vek partiye jinin karkarın Kurdistan'ı xwa penasetki de avakirin piştra peja o daydoji vek paşk partiya azadiye jinin Kurdistan xavatki ev jîr ser birdoziya rizgariya jin yani rigezin birdoziya azadiye jin vek de avakirin pişti yani piştin salin 2000'an ve guhartına paradigmayı ve gredayı paradigmaya demokratik ekolojik o ser esası azadiye jine davakirin ev demji hedi ali civat buyun da ligerin çetibin tekoşin çetibe yani rixistin buncubar ku bunge ki pir jî davakirin o doğru da jin rixistin avxa xoser avatke ev jem tukarın bejin despeke KGB komajinin bilind böyle gredayı yeja yani yektejinin azat o pişra komajinin bilind o yeja dibin yek evanjil veki komale jinin Kurdistan KGK de avakirin gredayı KGK jî emnaha meze bikin çor parçayı Kurdistan'ı li Rojava Kurdistan'ı kejar li Başuri Kurdistan'ı rejak li Bakuri Kurdistan'ı teja işte Rojava Kurdistan'ı kongresler li Avrupa TJK yani her beşin yani jin hebin jinin Kurd jinin internasyonel hamuyan jî doğruda yani yedi rixistin boyuna xwa yedi bejin mafya xwa digerin evna yani ali rixistin boyunda em dikarin bejin yani arteş boyun parti boyun o civaki boyun ev merhaleyene hundiri civaki da taybet Bakuri Kurdistan'da ali tevli boyuna siyasette evcib seri xwa dirokeke yani her beşin rastici mesela tekoşin niyati meşandın dirokak hattı nivsandın lorji mesela dirokak ali siyasete de tebliğine jin o siyasete de dirokak de nivsandın yani naha vek encamda hem Rojava Kurdistan'ı hem Bakur Başur Rojlat hem hamu cihan da jî vek sistema hevserokti peş dikevin disa heval yani embijin teoriya tevgeriye azadi jinin Kurdistan çinin yani despike de hayana haj bu yani kombu bebek resmi selimede çebibe magota ev ceribandına çetibin ev tekoşin ev şehadet ona hamuyan çetidin encamda yani teoriye haj nav jiyan eder tevgeri azadi jini ev jî yani komite azadi u yekevi mesela despikeden avakirin teoriya kutbuyne de avakirin u ev grede arteş buyun de çekirin burdoziya rizkari jini de ilan kirin o burdoziye regezin burdoziye azadiye jine jî wek welat Parîsî fikr xweşûkîn estetik de navkirin disa piştî yani ev dem civakbûnek ve hevpeymana civakî dikeve Rojava jinin tevgerê jin disa hewjiyana azad jinolojî wana hemûyan jî wek teoriyên em bêjin nav şoreşê da vek nav jiyanê da kedeke mezin hewdaneke mezin kurbûyineke mezin şerekî mezin de tên avakirin yani diroka tevgere jin rastî jî hem ali düşman yani hem beri düşman şerti de meşandın hem hundur da yani ali zayent niskatiyen zayenti niskatiyen zılamti heyi hem beri ve tekoşinti de meşandın hem beri poşferi tüye jin yani vaki cins vaki bejin zayent jin heyi de meşandın o bana hamu yani hemci ali Çin'i yani ali sınıfı da ali zana buna bilgice sosyalizm ve ev de meşandın bana hamu yani vek paradigmaya demokratik ve ekolojik ve ser esası azadiye jine serukati pişti salın 2000 vek şansa kemezin bu peşkeş kiri ve neci hamu vek ambijin şansa khahir mezin em tıkarın bınırkhinin zaten yani başuri Kurdistan'ı yani ev tekoşin tevlibuyna yani tekoşin ya da tevlibuyin 1990'dan çetibin o per hevalin şehit hani mesela başuri Kurdistan'ı disa heval viyan heye mesela başuri Kurdistan'ı 2006'an çalaki ki pek dine hevaleke büyük peşenk peşenge disa embijin Rojava Kurdistan'ı hevalin tevlibuyun xarna beri 1989 çetkin hene ev havalne ji ve grubin yekemin ejinan yani tevli şoreş edibin çetibin mesela ve balkeşe mesela yine grup hanel tabqa yani cara yekemin mesela gruba haş havalcın tabqa yani ve jinin Afrin'in lideri kum ona tevli buyune xaçetkin turda perverdeyn serokati tibinin yani hani evji pır mühime yani hani saha serokati ve ki akademiya Mahsun Korkmaz durda ji mesela perverdeyan ra den derbas kırın o yani kedeke pır mezin her alinde Rojlati Kurdistan işi embijin yani hani pişti 2000'an idi Rojlati Kurdistan işi hem Ali Parti boyunda hem Ali Civaki boyunda gaften avetin Rojava Kurdistan işi aynı bir şekli gaften avetin Rojava Kurdistan 2005'an yani Ali Parti boyunda dema gaften avetin ve deme heval Şilan Kobanê keve wanjî yani hani vek parçaya da jî rêxistin bûyîn yani pêşketine jinên Kurdistanê parçayan da jî dîsa nav dîroka tevgere da be hev ra yani girêdayê hev pêş dikeve.
So what we can say is that the Kurdish women's movement has been organizing itself autonomously in basically three different realms. On one hand, there's the military sphere. And as I mentioned previously, the first steps were taken with the martyrdom of Yilmaz Karataş Beritan. But at the same time, not only in the military sphere, but also in the societal sphere and also in the sphere of political ideological organizing. So towards the second half of the 1990s, the process of so after the autonomous army steps had been taken, the Kurdish women's movement started to form its own party structure. So this began first with the PJKK, which is the party of women workers in Kurdistan, Women's Workers' Party of Kurdistan, and which was later on, this was formed in the late 1990s, and it was later on named the Free Women's Party, PJYA, and it's now the Freedom Party of Women in Kurdistan, PASHK, since 2004, and this is very much coincided, or it was restructured along the lines of the new paradigm of a democratic women's liberationist and ecological paradigm. But also in the societal sphere, in the meantime, of course, the movement had taken several important steps. And it's important here to mention that the first, usually practical steps were taken, events took place, a martyrdom took place, and then the practice then informed the theory. So it was not the case that there was a theory from which to then move on to a practice, but it was often the other way around, or the things theory and practice went hand in hand. As I mentioned, in the realm of self-defense, people organize themselves against states, and now also against Daesh and other people. Then in the sphere of party formation, ideologically and politically, steps were taken. But then later on in the societal sphere as well, the High Women's Council, KGB, turned into the Free Women's Union, YJA, and it's now the Union of Communities in Kurdistan, the KJK, which is basically in charge of organizing women in all spheres of social and political life. And now the movement is organized in a confederal manner, which means that in every part of Kurdistan, there's a different umbrella under which the women's movement is organizing itself. For example, it's Kejar in eastern Kurdistan, Iran. It's Rejak in southern Kurdistan, Iraq. It's Teja in northern Kurdistan, Turkey. In Rojava, it's Kongrestan, and in Europe, it's the Kurdish women's movement in Europe. And of course, at the same time, there are different mechanisms and structures that the movement has introduced, such as the co-presidency system, and its theory continued to develop itself. I can give a short overview of the meaning of the theory of the different stages of how the theory of the Kurdish freedom movement, women's movement, developed ideologically. In the beginning, as I mentioned, there were freedom and equality committees. Later on, especially in the time in the 1990s, during the autonomous organization in the military sphere, the theory of separation, or theory of separation was put forward, and then later the women's liberation ideology was discussed and developed. And all of these were steps towards developing an autonomous women's ideology. And the principles of the women's liberation ideology that are still valid today, and these were first, as I mentioned, discussed in the 1990s, the first being patriotism, and then free thinking, free acting, organizedness, struggle, and ethics and aesthetics. Of course, afterwards, also several steps were taken towards developing also a social contract. So this was again towards the end of the 1990s, where women set their terms for how a free life is possible by writing a women's social contract. And now other concepts and terms are developed, such as free co-life, or now with the development of genealogy as a science of women and life. These things have been taken further. Another thing that I want to mention is the fact that this was always also a very internationalist movement, because from the start, it was not just Kurdish women who were part of this struggle. Many of the women who died or who were part of the early stages, they were not Kurdish themselves. There were groups in places like Tabqa, for example, or in Afrin, where women during the early stages of the movement's organization, especially in Syria and northern Syria, many Arab women joined these structures, but also they went to get education in the Masum Korkmaz Academy in Lebanon. And increasingly, more and more women from southern Kurdistan, from Iraqi Kurdistan, joined the movement. We have many martyrs also from this region, and also from eastern Kurdistan, from Rojava. And now, of course, we see that things have been taken further, even more with the revolution in Rojava, where all of these steps that have been taken in the past are finding a new concrete form. And of course, there are also internationalist martyrs in the movement.
نها ev yani xalek ditir mühim eve ma got yani rixistin buyun ava bu piştî wê em mêzê dikin yani piştî salên 2010 şinda yani şoreşa Rojava 2012 çêdibe şoreşa Rojava yani wisa em bêjin hem alî hemberî dijmin şêrkirdin da hem hundir da em bêjin sistemek avakirdin da rolekî xwe pir mezin li cîhanê giştî de çêdibe. O YPJ de avakirin, YPG, YPJ de avakirin. Yani evna hemû vek encamî diroka tevgerejinin. Yani ev zaten şu xwe serûxwe seminereke ez nakevim vê mijare. Dîsa mesela birdoziya azadiya jin yani hinek semineri dîtir hene yani em nakevin wana tene diyalektikeke ez dixwazim parve bikim. Niha êdî rêxistinbûyîna xurt rêxistinbûyîna jin dema xurt dibe êrişên dijmin jî hemberî ve çêdibin. İşte li sala 2013 li hemberî heval Sara, heval Rojbîn û heval Leyla êrişa hatî meşandin, êrişa hatî kirin, katliama hatî kirin. Armancê xwe ew ekî îradeya jin xata azadî yani îradeya jinê xata azadî de bişkînin. Heval Sara damezranî PKK'ye, heval Rojbîn qada diplomasî û giştî vebûyînê hereketa jin vebûyînê ve heval ronahî jî hevaleke civan e. Yani her sê heval jî erkê xwe hemû taybet hatine hilbijartin û ev şehadetê de çêdikirin ev hemberî xata azadiya jin vebûyîna em bêjin xata azadiya jin tê çêkirin ev qatliam em pêwîst e wisa binirxînin. Dîsa yani ev aslında alî birdozî em bêjin alî ruhê şoreşa jinê alî ruhê şoreşa tevgera azadiya jinê dide nîşandan yani hemberî we êrişek de meşandin û xwedî derketineke li ser cîhanê jî çêdibe. Hemû aliyan da mesela xwedî derkineke mezin çêdibe ew jî em bêjin misyona heval Sarava û keda heval Sara heval Rojbîn heval ronahî ve girêdayî pêş dikevin. Dîsa yani em mêzê bikin 2016 jî dîsa sê heval tên şehit dikevin. Ev hevalne jî li Bakurê Kurdistanê şehit dikevin heval Sevê, heval Pakîze û heval Fatmayê. Ev êrişî hemberî heval Sevê, heval Fatma, heval Pakîze hatî kirin jî armanca xwe dîsa ser esasî îradeya jin ê civakî bişkîne. Ji ber ku wê demê berxwedaniya yani berxwedaniya rêveberiyên cevherî hene mesela wê demê tekoşînekî mezin li Sûriye, li Cizre, Siropya li her derekê li tê meşandin. Li hemberî jin jî taybet polîtikayên tê meşandin em dixwazin nîşan bidin. Her sê heval dema şehîd dikevin ew jî hemberî îradeya jin ê civakîbûyînê aslında ev şehadet tê meşandin. Dîsa mesela li Qaraçox yani 2017 dema Qaraçox jî hemberî yani artêşbûyîna jin êrişte çêkirin. Heval Nalîn, heval Hêlin, heval Şervîn yani turda şehîd dikevin. Ew jî mesela hemberî îradeya jin parastina cevherî em dikarin binirxînin. Yani ev rastî heye ki mesela dîroka jinê de jinên Kurdistanê de tevgera azadiya jin yani destpêka xwe de heya niha gav bi gav xwe înşa dike, gav bi gav xwe mezin dike, civakîbûyîna xwe alî yani fikir da, alî ruhî da, alî civakîbûyîne de ev gavana hemûyan davêje û dijmin jî farqê ve de dixwaze wê îradeyê bişkînin. Hemberî wê jî em bêjin hewldanên çalakiyên tên çêkirin hem alî gerîla da hem alî qada civakî de alî hemû rêxistin alî hemû alîyan da ev çalakiyan jî tên çêkirin. Ev min xwast ez balê bikişînim yani wek ber bi encam em diçin ji ber ku êdîtir heval yani hani tiştê herî girîng yek jî ew e ki mesela hereketa tevgera azadiya jin tevgereke internasyonalîst e yani destpêkê de heya niha tevlîbûyînên internasyonal çêdibin yani em bêjin zaten PKK xwe tevgerek internasyonist şeydi xoye keminci heval haki qarere hevaleki Türk'e aynı ev diyalektik tevgera azadiye jindaji berdevamtike yani ruhu kay internasyonel ruhu kay sosyalist durdaj berdevamtike yani ev havalin despike beşler tıbın evak heval Türkan Demirel heye heval Hüsnü Akgül heval Nermin Akkuş heval Senem Bertan yani ev havalına tevlibuyne çetkin pir hevalin şehit hene دیسا مثلا هوال آندریا وولف هی 1997 شهید کرده هوال آندریا هوال روناهی یعنی وقتی خود نوخه هوال روناهی هوال آندریا وولف اوجی مثلا نو شورش شده امیشه بسیک نخا به تبلیغ بوی نخا به باوری آخا شورش باوری آخا سوسیالیسم باوری آخا روحیشن یعنی هر عالی آنده وسا وقتی میناک تگردن دیسا مثلا ev şoptarın hevalin internasyonel jî bejin yani meguta yani tevgereme pek park her yani internasyonel ruhu kha yeki kha ser internasyonalizm o sosyalizm xavat ki şoptarı xoj vek emtkarın bejin şora Rojava da vek işte heval Anna Campbell heval Anna Sanchez disa yani hani haval destan yürük haval kader ortakaya yani per haval u sebek şoptarın haval Hüsnü Akgül u haval Andrea Wolfşi nav şoreş ama da çiğ xatıgırın evji yani vek ali şoreş ama ali xoy internasyonalist de nişandan yani hem Ali Netevi, hem Ali Çini, Ali Jin, Ali Internasyonel yani her Ali yandan tıkarın bir jin diruka tevgera azadiye jin nırxin pirmezin avat kirine o ev nırxana biriya em bejin teori heyi o biriya ilmi jinoloji o gişti tıkaze yani o hamu jina rajı parve bike ev seminer jinek Almanca xa ev bu خلاص بكن ببورنن يعني هناك وصل دريج بوج باركو برتش هي يعني اش شورش شهيدا يا شور بارتي شهيدا يا جبو هيجي انسان خوازه حمو هبالان بخجي جبو هناك دريج بو تمام
Since in the 2010s, of course, with the development of the revolution in Rojava, we see that increasingly more the Kurdish women's movement has taken it on itself to establish, to create an autonomous system. So many people know, of course, about the struggle and the fight of the YPJ and the YPG, the People's Protection Units and the Women's Protection Units, and how they have led the resistance against the so-called Islamic State. But basically, what we can say is that what we see is that the more women organize, the more women struggle, the more they actually face attacks, all-out attacks. And just to give you some examples of attacks that the Kurdish women's movement has experienced in recent years, in 2013, on January 9th in Paris, 3 Kurdish women revolutionaries, Sakine Cansız, Fidan Doğan, and Leyla Şaylemez, Sara, Rojbin, and Ronahi were murdered in the heart of Paris, and they represented different by somebody linked to the Turkish intelligence, and they basically represented different spheres of the struggle. Of course, Sakine Cansız, as previously mentioned, she has been leading the movement on so many different levels, ideologically and also militarily in terms of resistance. Fidan Doğan, Rojbin, in the middle here, she represented the political struggle, the diplomatic struggle of the Kurdish freedom movement, and Leyla Şaylemez was part of the youth movement. And in general, this attack, this murder, was interpreted as an attack on the line of women's liberation. And this is very important because it actually was followed by very similar attacks, such as the ones committed against 3 activists within Turkish borders in northern Kurdistan in 2016, where once again three comrades were killed, Seve, Fatma, and Pakize, who were actually all three civilians who were resisting against the Turkish state's attacks on northern Kurdistan at the time as women activists, and they were murdered by the Turkish army as well. So this was also, this showed that women who resist in the societal sphere are also targets of the state and patriarchal forces. And similarly, there are many other martyrs that have been killed basically because of their actions, as because of their organizedness as women. There are also internationalists who have died in the struggle, as I mentioned before. Among them are Hüsnü Akgül, Nermin Akkuş, Senem Bertan, and others. But also it's important to note that the first martyr of the Kurdistan Workers' Party was actually Haki Kader, who was killed in the early 1980s, and in late 1970s, and he was actually a Turkish person. So the movement has also grown with internationalist value, because it is an internationalist movement. It also from the start also had internationalist martyrs. For example, also from Europe, Andrea Wolf, for example, was a woman who was killed in the war in the 1990s. She had joined from Germany, and in recent years, also with the resistance in Rojava, women such as Alina Sanchez or Anna Campbell, but also Destan and Kader Ortakaya, for example, from Turkey. So from many different parts of the world, women have fallen in the ranks of the Kurdistan revolution. And as a result of decades of struggle, many values were developed. Now, the values, the experiences that the women's movement has accumulated over the course of decades are now being systematized, organized, for example, through the theories developed with gynology as a science of women in life, through different ways of autonomous and self-organization of women. And the Kurdish women's movement wants to share all of this accumulation, share all of these experiences and this knowledge with women and women's struggles around the world. So I will stop here, but I want to say that it's something that, you know, we consider this as a universal revolution that we want to share with women in the world. And the purpose of this session was to just give you an overview of the rich history of the Kurdish women's movement. And because there's so much to say, and because this is a movement, a struggle that has developed with its martyrs, I also wanted to do justice by saying a bit about each one of them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dilar, for that translation. And thank you very much, Heval Nagahan, for your presentation. Gelek spas, Heval Nagahan. Just as a reminder, you can ask questions whether you're watching on the YouTube live stream or you're on the Zoom call with us here. You can ask questions in the chat section of these videos. And while any people perhaps like get their thoughts together if they're going to have any questions, I'm just going to go and make some of the announcements. So this session has been an introductory session of a wider series put together, as we said, by the Kurdish women's movement. So the next series in this session, the next session in this series is called Towards a Democratic Society with the Co-Chair System, and it will be presented by HDP's Aisha Berktay. So as we said, this is an introductory session, and to give particularly a overview of the history, but future sessions will certainly go more into depth into aspects of the Kurdish women's movement and Kurdish women's liberation ideology. So please stay tuned for the upcoming sessions. The next one is next Sunday on the 21st of June. We also have a parallel panel series, which, as we mentioned at the beginning, the first one was on the politics of prisons and a women's critique of it. That's on our YouTube page, so you can go ahead and re-watch that. The next session in that series, in the panel series, will be on Sunday, 12th of July, titled The Coronavirus Pandemic as a Litmus Test of Capitalist Modernity. And we're not announcing them just yet, but we have very exciting speakers lined up for that one. So please join us. And again, as we mentioned, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, because all of these sessions will be live streamed and also kept on there, so you can keep up to date. And I'm not sure if we have any questions. Okay, so we don't have any questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us and choosing this session. And choosing to tune in to find out a bit about the Kurdish women's movement's history when there's so many other sessions going on at the moment. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for everyone for joining us in the Zoom call as well. And I think we're going to end it there. Like we said, this will stay up on our YouTube channel. And also please follow us on what comes up on the screen right now. So the Jenny social media accounts, which is the Kurdish Women's Peace Office based in Germany. We've also started a campaign, particularly for political prisoners, called Solidarity Keeps Us Alive. So please keep looking out for material on that campaign, and please keep sharing it, particularly during this time. Prisons are, essentially a death trap, and in Turkey it's a specific issue. There's tens of thousands of political prisoners in Turkish prisons. So I think we're going to end it there. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we have one question. So before we end, we're going to ask that question. One second. Okay. Have Zealand de خواستش تكتيجي؟
Na, yani eş spastikım. Yani bu من جرباندن کنو bu yekemin bu. Keyif hoş bum. Yani seminer esbavar mi berdevam bukun yani hani şbar ko dirok pır berfrehne yani pır adi xo hene yani insan tkara sal sal jî insan tkara vakt teori jî rexsin hemû yan berxine ji bo wê jî dem jî kin bu yani eş spas dikim baş.
So Nakahan thanks everyone again for joining us tonight, and that she says, like for many of us actually, that this has been an experiment to join a seminar from this in this way. So thank you very much. This was a start, and there'll be many other sessions to come. So thank you very much for joining us. And again, the video will stay up on our YouTube channel, so please share them with anyone who may be interested in this topic, and take care, and hope to see you all soon.
Dem baş. Xalas.
Dem baş.